Howdy everyone, and let's get straight into reviewing the living daylights out of a pretty exciting new super zoom lens, the Tamron 50-400mm f4.5-6.3 Di III VC VXD. It is for Sony E-mount mirrorless cameras, full frame or aps-c, and after a short delay it's finally making its way onto store shelves now. The most attention-grabbing thing about this new lens is obviously its very interesting and broad zoom range. One of my favourite lenses in the world is the Sigma 60-600mm. It's very big, very heavy and very expensive, so I like what Tamron are doing here with this new lens. Sure, the zoom range is shorter, but it starts a bit wider, which is pretty useful, and this thing is actually small enough for your camera bag, and at 1.1 kilograms or about 2.5 pounds, it's light enough to hold for long periods of time. Oh, and its price of $1,300 or £1,250 here in the UK is a bit more affordable, although still rather expensive. 400mm may not be 500 or 600mm, but it's still a fantastic reach, just about long enough for bird and wildlife photography, and you can always crop into your image a bit if your camera is high enough resolution. Something I will mention though is that this is rather a dark lens. Zoom into 150mm and already your maximum aperture will have darkened to f6.3, so the lens won't be giving you snappy shutter speeds or deeply out of focus backgrounds. I'd like to thank Tamron's UK distributor for loaning me a copy of this lens for testing for a couple of weeks, although as usual this is a totally independent review. Let's look at its build quality first, and this thing feels as solid to hold in your hand as it looks smart and understated. It's based on a metal lens mount with some strong weather sealing, and at the rear there's also a waterproof USB input for updating the lens's firmware and changing its customizable controls, including a new focus limiter function. Then there's a little gap for an optional tripod mount, which is sold separately. Then comes a plastic focus ring, which turns fairly smoothly. As you can see here, the lens doesn't show much in the way of focus breathing, which is good news. The lens's autofocus motor works silently, accurately, and reasonably quickly in single-shot autofocus mode. In continuous autofocus mode, the motor works almost instantaneously, and I found it to track subjects quite well. In front of the focus ring come a couple of buttons for customizing the lens and adjusting the image stabilization. Let's take a look at that stabilization in action. Here's some footage with it turned off and now turned on. As you can see, it's helping, but not making a huge difference by any means. Then comes the lens's rubberized zoom ring, which can be locked in place at 50mm. It turns very evenly and averagely smoothly with just a touch of stickiness to it, which is presumably deliberate to stop it falling under its own weight. The lens's front filter size is 67mm, and it comes with a beautifully designed plastic hood, which simply clicks in place. Overall, the build quality is excellent, although I do wish the image stabilization were a little more effective. Alright, image quality. I'll be testing it today on a Sony a7R III camera with its 42MP full frame sensor. In-camera corrections are turned on. At 50mm and f4.5 we see razor sharpness and excellent contrast in the middle of the image, and the corners very slightly softer but still looking fantastic. f5.6 looks the same, but f8 looks a bit brighter and punchier in the corners. The lens stays this sharp down to f16, where diffraction causes softness. Let's zoom in about halfway to 200mm. The maximum aperture has darkened to f6.3. In the middle of the image we see excellent sharpness and contrast again, and again great sharpness over in the corners too. Stop down to f8 for a touch of extra sharpness in those corners, and f11 looks just as good. Finally, let's zoom all the way in to 400mm. At f6.3, image quality still looks great in the middle of the image, but with just a touch less contrast than before. Over in the corners we're finally seeing some softness, but only really right in the edges. At f8 or f11 we don't really see much improvement, I'm afraid. So overall it's an excellent performance, apart from those corners at 400mm, but it's worth bearing in mind that often at 400mm you're zooming into a specific subject and getting out of focus backgrounds anyway. Alright, let's see about vignetting and distortion on a full frame camera. These pictures are taken with in-camera corrections turned off. At 50mm, we see moderate pincushion distortion and noticeable vignetting in the corners at f4.5. Stop down to f5.6 or f8 to see that vignetting go away. The pincushion distortion gets worse as you zoom in, becoming pretty strong at 400mm, and vignetting is still strong at the widest aperture. Stopping down to f8 or f11 brightens those corners up again. The lens's minimum focus distance is 2.5 meters. At 400mm, that gives you a decent magnification. Close-up image quality is a little softer, with lower contrast. At f8 we see a nice increase in contrast, but stopping down further doesn't improve the sharpness. Let's see how the lens works against bright lights now. It's great news here. Whether you're zoomed in or out, we see very low flaring and contrast remains good. And finally, bokeh. As I've mentioned before, due to the lens's rather dark maximum aperture, you're not getting the most out of focus backgrounds here, but obviously you can still zoom in for some separation, and it's not the softest bokeh I've ever seen here, I'll be honest. It's a bit bitty, just a little smudgy, but more strongly out of focus backgrounds will look nice and soft. Overall, the Tamron 50-400mm is a great offering for a certain market, people who want a great zoom range and decent image quality, but who want something lighter and more compact than, say, the hefty Sigma 60-600mm lenses. The disadvantages of this Tamron lens against those are that it doesn't zoom in quite as far, of course. I wasn't impressed with its image stabilization either, and it doesn't offer quite the softest bokeh in the world, but apart from that it works fine, and it's quite a handy proposition really, a great zoom range, and it's not a pain to carry around with you, so it certainly comes recommended. So there you go. I like testing something different once in a while. I'd like to say a huge thank you to my Patreon supporters who make such a difference to keeping this channel going. Check it out in the description below. Supporters get all kinds of exclusive bonus content. Ciao for now, everyone.